This video is really more of a discussion than it is of teaching, because we're going to look at a subject that is rarely taught and not very often discussed either, and it's the subject of soul strengthening. Let me give you a couple of examples from Scripture. Matthew in his Gospel in chapter 11 quoted Jesus saying this: "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And then Paul wrote, actually no, not Paul, it was Luke, my apologies, it was Luke wrote in chapter 14 of Acts, that after Paul and Barnabas had proclaimed the good news to Derbe and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, then on to Iconium and Antioch. There they strengthened the souls of the disciples. So the above from Acts is a part of the story of the journeys of Paul and Barnabas, and these events took place over a long period of time. They spent several months in each place strengthening the disciples' souls and then appointing leaders in those places. And soul strengthening was needed for those disciples because they were still relatively new in their faith, but it was also needed to help them to overcome the deeply occult environment in the places in which they lived. Emperor worship and the occult generally had real strongholds in the cities and towns of those days, and life was very hard for the Christians who refused to compromise their faith by worshipping any other than Yahweh. Compromise was the only way for Christians to avoid real persecution and for them not to suffer exclusion from being able to work and to trade in society. So the word souls indicated a real depth of strengthening that went far beyond the modern idea of mere Christian education, or of requiring morally upright behaviour, and it showed the apostles' strong commitment to the task of deep discipleship. This was no quick exercise, as the Greek text made clear, and strengthening of souls involved regular and consistent teaching, as well as direct and often repeated soul ministry in the power of the Holy Spirit. Yet, Christian commentators on this section of Acts 14 do not explore what they strengthen the souls of the disciples actually means in practice. So we're going to explore and seek revelation that's needed if we are to understand how to strengthen souls. Exploration and revelation should first major on seeing how Jesus ministered to his own disciples, as well as then seeing other examples from the Scriptures that can help us to identify and to understand what it means to strengthen souls. And this leads us to ask the most obvious, the most basic, and the most important of questions that we need to ask if we are to discover what it means to strengthen souls. And that question, of course, is, what is the soul? Genesis 2:7 says, "Yahweh Elohim formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." And only humankind had the breath of life breathed into it. So humankind was both self-aware and God-aware, and it was the only part of Yahweh's creation that was so. Therefore, only humankind had a soul, and that is what separated humankind from all the other creatures. The soul is the eternal, everlasting, mystical and God-breathed part of a self-aware and a God-aware human being. And the soul is the part of a human being that survives the death of the body. Thus, the eternal soul is the true storage area for each individual's memories, feelings, revelations and truthing. Thus, the death of the body, and therefore the death of the brain, does not affect the person's retention of those things. The soul is the being in human being. Now, if we're to engage in soul ministry and to strengthen souls, there are two closely connected factors that are essential for true soul ministry, both in those who are ministering to souls and in those souls that are being ministered to. The first is open hearts, and the second is trust. Now, these two factors may seem to be obvious, but they're not really. How many people do you really trust? And how many people do you really have an open heart towards? And the Apostle Paul was well aware of the importance of open hearts and trust. An open heart is a soft and teachable heart, but a hard heart is fixed in its own ways, and the hard heart cannot experience truthing. In 2 Corinthians, Paul wrote this: "We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children, open wide your hearts also." So, let's explore some areas where soul ministry is both needed and can be very helpful. And the first is the area of music and song. Let me read from 1 Samuel 16. Now the spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from Yahweh tormented him. And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, I'm having a right mess of this. Let me try that one again. And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand, and Saul would be relieved and feel better, and the evil spirit would depart from him. Why did the evil spirit respond to music? Well, my answer is that the evil spirit didn't respond to the music. It responded to David, who played the music. Now, music is perfectly capable of ministering to souls without the use of lyrics, and the classical composers understood that very well. Different moods of music can minister deeply to us in our own different moods and circumstances, and music can also help us to have our moods changed, even though our circumstances may not change. Modern worship, in its hurry and its noise, often loses sight of the spiritual aspects of both music and song. This is especially true of the neglected, quiet, reflective music that helps us to ask the difficult questions of life, just the kind of questions that the psalmists were asking thousands of years ago. Now, music and song were central to Jesus' relationship with his disciples, and as found at the end of the Passover with them and Jesus together. Matthew 26 says this, that when Jesus and his disciples had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And the Greek text uses the definitive article the, not the indefinite article a, and this indicates that they regularly used one psalm together. Now, songs of praise and worship are certainly important, but it is also important to have room in our services and in our lives for songs that ask the hard questions of life. For example, the 1960s and 70s were full of songs that asked hard questions of life. And one question that every human being asks of themselves and others at some point in their lives is, who am I? The Who, from a song called The Seeker in 1970, said this: I asked Bobby Dylan, I asked the Beatles, I asked Timothy Leary, but he couldn't help me either. They call me the Seeker. And then later, 8 years later, in another song called Who Are You?, that was exactly the question the Who asked. Tell me, who are you? Lots of questions being asked. The Moody Blues had a 1970 hit single called Question, in which they asked this: why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? They didn't get any answers, and it's not surprising that another of their songs in 1972 asked, isn't life strange? George Harrison asked, what is life, in 1970, And that song was actually the B-side of his huge hit, My Sweet Lord. So on the A side, he's talking about My Sweet Lord, and on the B side, he's saying, what is life? There are so many valid and important questions that were asked in those 2 decades. There were a great many songs that raised life questions in those days, and Christian singer-songwriters needed to engage with those songs in order to establish real and meaningful debate. But they didn't. Now let's move on and think about touch. Before a newborn baby needs anything else, it needs touch. Touch had been a massive part of the baby's life while it was still in the mother's womb. Matthew 17 says this: Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and he led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. So Jesus touched before he spoke. He touched, and then he said, Get up and do not be afraid. But you know, our society today is rapidly making touch a crime. Matthew 20 records this incident. There were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they shouted, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. The crowd sternly ordered them to be quiet, but they shouted even louder, Have mercy on us, Lord, Son of David. Jesus stood still and called them, saying, What do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Lord, let our eyes be opened. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Why did Jesus ask the 2 blind men, What do you want me to do for you? Wasn't it obvious? And Jesus, in compassion, touched the 2 blind men, but without any words. And those 2 formerly blind men then became his disciples and followed him. And yet, our society today is rapidly making touch a crime. Mark 1 records this incident. A leper came to Jesus begging him, and kneeling he said to him, If you choose, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do choose. Be made clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus' compassion here was shown by touch and words together. Yet our society today is rapidly making touch a crime. Luke 22 records this incident. Then one of Jesus' disciples struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, No more of this, and he touched his ear and healed him. Jesus touched the slave to correct the mistake that had been made by his overzealous disciple. And yet, our society today is rapidly making touch a crime. Let's move on and think about 1-with-1 or 1-to-1. While each of us is limited in how many people we can work with one-to-one, we should ensure that our existing one-to-one discipling relationships and our practice of soul strengthening are as effective as they can be. It is important for us to establish the best way or ways to soul strengthen each individual that we have a relationship with, as one size does not fit all. The foundation of discipleship may be the same for all disciples, but the application of discipleship should engage with each individual according to that individual's needs and weaknesses, and not according to a religious formula. Then there's group work, and group work is a very good opportunity for the strengthening of souls, as long as the group has honesty and integrity, and each group member has each other's trust. The group must have a solid foundation of trust and integrity in order for soul strengthening to be a practiced reality in this group. Therefore, groups need to be together over a reasonably long period of time in order to allow their relationships to grow. Let's move on and think about example. Jesus clearly showed his character and nature by word and deed to his own disciples during the almost 3 years that he was with them. They learned a lot from watching Jesus and then doing under Jesus' watchful eye. Many of the crowds who seemed to always be close to Jesus would also have learned from Jesus as they watched how he related to the various people groups while he was in the public eye. And one benefit of a smaller local church is that people can get to know each other well, and they can build meaningful relationships over a longer period. Knowing and being known makes soul strengthening possible, and that soul strengthening can work both ways. Now, want to think about the way that the apostles exhorted them to continue in their faith in the account that we read. Very briefly, Paul and Barnabas were not being gentle or passive in exhorting the disciples here, but they were actually being quite forceful and strong in exhorting them, because of the potential of persecution and the hardships that were going to win the day in the churches if they compromised. And strengthening souls means leading disciples into the revelation of their identity in Yahweh, and then on to the specifics of what they are to do under Yahweh's direction. Now let's think about soul ties. And we're going now to 1 Samuel 18. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armour, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And soul ties are created by the Holy Spirit, and they are founded upon a covenant relationship. But covenant soul ties cannot be organised by mere human effort, and covenant soul ties cannot be timetabled by any human being. Any covenant relationship should never be entered into lightly, and certainly not without considerable reflection. Now, in terms of strengthening souls, let's think about creativity. As we saw earlier, Yahweh Elohim spoke, and it was so. If Yahweh still speaks of words of creation in our world today, then Yahweh is still creative in our world today. And humankind was made in Yahweh's image and likeness. We human beings speak words of creation too. The only question is what those words are creating or destroying. Creating by our words is very powerful for good or for bad. And this is especially important for children as they grow up. If you're an adult, remember when you were a child how you felt if a parent's promise had to be broken and you didn't understand that. Let's think briefly about art. Creation as art. Look around you at the hills, the mountains, the seas, the fields. And art within creation, the amazing variety of flowers and herbs and trees, and Jesus' own examples from creation. Art always represents an unseen reality. Art is not the thing itself. And then there's dancing. Dancing as celebration, dancing as rejoicing. If your heart is dancing, your body will want to dance too. King David danced before Yahweh. And psalms of praise were used for dancing, and they reflected the book of Deuteronomy that Israel saw as being Yahweh's love song to their people. And we can rejoice alone, in a group, or in a large gathering. Want to think very briefly about dreams and visions, because dreams and visions are a very important reality that are often overlooked, often discounted, and often mistrusted. Do we know how to handle our own dreams and visions? And is interpretation of dreams a lost art? Because consistent dreams and visions can point in the same direction, and dreams and visions can fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Then there's knowing. Experience is true knowing, and true knowing grows through experience. Personally known and personally knowing. This is not about mere facts or data, etc. Knowing will, heart and mind in order to know how to speak and to act. And that involves listening. Not just hearing, but actually listening. I spoke earlier about music and how often do we actually listen to music or to songs rather than having them just on in background. So listening intently and responding appropriately is a good way to strengthen souls. And then there's testimony, what Yahweh is doing in and through every single one of us. No exclusions because of age or race or denomination or anything else. No exclusions. And knowing the will, the heart and the mind of Yahweh so that it can be worked out in our lives. And our experience is of far greater value than any mere theological viewpoint that we're clinging tightly to. Finally, in this video discussion, let's think about prophecy for a few moments. What part can prophecy play? Upbuilding prophecy can be given in public or in private, but prophecy should be used to build up. It can be used to challenge and it can be used to ask questions, but corrective prophecy should always be shared in private, and there should be no negative use of prophecy. I will be very interested in your thoughts on soul strengthening, your experiences, and what you think in response to what I've shared in this video. You can do that with comments beneath the video, or you can email me directly. The email address is shown in my YouTube site. Thank you for watching.